Chapter 2, which is mostly about the things that happen after funerals. Fat Charlie puffed his way through the Memorial Garden of Rest, squinting at the Florida sunshine. Sweat stains were spreading across his suit, beginning with the armpits and the chest. Sweat began to pour down his face as he ran. The Memorial Garden of Rest did, in fact, look very much like a garden, but a very odd garden, in which all the flowers were artificial, and they grew from metal vases protruding from metal plaques set in the ground. Fat Charlie ran past a sign. "Free burial space for all honorably discharged veterans," it said. He ran through Babyland, where multicolored windmills and sodden blue and pink teddy bears joined the artificial flowers on the Florida turf. A moldering Winnie the Pooh stared up wanly at the blue sky. Fat Charlie could see the funeral party now, and he changed direction, finding a path that allowed him to run towards it. There were 30 people, perhaps more, standing around the grave. The women wore dark dresses and big black hats trimmed with black lace like fabulous flowers. The men wore suits without sweat stains. The children looked solemn. Fat Charlie slowed his pace to a respectful walk, still trying to hurry without moving fast enough for anyone to notice that he was in fact hurrying, and, having reached the group of mourners, he attempted to edge his way to the front ranks without attracting too much attention. Seeing that by now he was panting like a walrus who had just had to tackle a flight of stairs, was dripping with sweat, and trod on several feet as he went by, this attempt proved to be a failure. There were glares, which Fat Charlie tried to pretend he did not notice. Everyone was singing a song that Fat Charlie did not know. He moved his head in time with the song and tried to make it look as if he was sort of singing, moving his lips in a way that might have meant that he was actively singing along, sotto voce, and he might have been muttering a prayer under his breath, and might have just been random lip motion. He took the opportunity to look down at the casket. He was pleased to see that it was closed. The casket was a glorious thing, made of what looked like heavy-duty reinforced steel, gunmetal gray. In the event of the glorious resurrection, thought Fat Charlie, when Gabriel blows his mighty horn and the dead escape their coffins, his father was going to be stuck in his grave, banging away futilely at the lid, wishing he had been buried with a crowbar and possibly an oxyacetylene torch. A final, deeply melodic hallelujah faded away. In the silence that followed, Fat Charlie could hear someone shouting at the other end of the memorial gardens, back near where he had come in. The preacher said, "Now, does anyone have anything they want to say in memory of the dear departed?" By the expressions on the faces of those nearest to the grave, it was obvious that several of them were planning to say things. But Fat Charlie knew it was a now or never moment. You need to make peace with your dad, you know. Right. He took a deep breath and a step forward, so he was at the right edge of the grave. And he said, excuse me, right, I think I have something to say." The distant shouting was getting louder. Several of the mourners were casting glances back over their shoulders to see where it was coming from. The rest of them were staring at Fat Charlie. "I was never what you would call close to my father," said Fat Charlie. "I suppose we didn't really know how. I've not been part of his life for 20 years, and he hasn't been part of mine. There's a lot of things it's hard to forgive, but then one day you turn around and you've got no family left." He wiped a hand across his forehead. "I don't think I've ever said I love you, Dad, in my whole life. All of you probably knew him better than I did. Some of you may have loved him. You were a part of his life and I wasn't. So I'm not ashamed that any of you should hear me say it. Say it for the first time in at least 20 years. He looked down at the impregnable metal casket lid. "I love you," he said, "and I'll never forget you." The shouting got even louder, and now it was loud enough and clear enough, in the silence that followed Fat Charlie's statement, for everyone to be able to make out the words being bellowed across the memorial gardens. "Fat Charlie, you stop bothering those people and get your ass over here, this minute!" Fat Charlie stared at the sea of unfamiliar faces, their expressions a seething stew of shock, puzzlement, anger, and horror. Ears burning, he realized the truth. Sorry, wrong funeral, he said. A small boy with big ears and an enormous smile said, proudly, "That was my grandma." Fat Charlie backed through the small crowd, mumbling barely coherent apologies. He wanted the world to end now. He knew it was not his father's fault, but also he knew that his father would have found it hilarious. Standing on the path, her hands on her hips, was a large woman with gray hair and thunder in her face. Fat Charlie walked towards her as he would have walked across a minefield, 9 years old again and in trouble. "You didn't hear me yelling?" she asked. "You went right on past me, making an embarrassment of yourself." The way she said embarrassment made it begin with the letter H. "Back this way," she said. "You missed the service and everything, but there's a shovel full of dirt waiting for you." Mrs. Higgler had barely changed in the last 2 decades. She was a little fatter and a little grayer. Her lips were pressed tightly together, and she led the way down one of the Memorial Garden's many paths. Fat Charlie suspected that he had not made the best possible first impression. She led the way, and, in disgrace, Fat Charlie followed. A lizard zapped up one of the struts of the metal fence at the edge of the Memorial Garden, then poised itself at the top of a spike, tasting the thick Florida air. The sun had gone behind a cloud, but, if anything, the afternoon was getting hotter. The lizard puffed its neck out into a bright orange balloon. 2 long-legged cranes he had taken initially for lawn ornaments looked up at him as he passed. One of them darted its head down and rose again, with a large frog dangling from its beak. It began, in a series of gulping movements, to try and swallow the frog, which kicked and flailed in the air. "Come on," said Miss Higgler. "Don't dawdle. Bad enough you missing your own father's funeral." Fat Charlie suppressed the urge to say something about having come 4,000 miles already that day, and having rented a car and driven down from Orlando, and how he had got off at the wrong exit, and whose idea was it anyway to tuck a garden of rest behind a Walmart on the very edge of town. They kept walking past a large concrete building that smelled of formaldehyde, until they reached an open grave at the very farthest reaches of the property. There was nothing beyond this but a high fence, and beyond that, a wilderness of trees and palms and greenery. In the grave was a modest wooden coffin. It had several mounds of dirt on it already. Beside the grave was a pile of earth and a shovel. Mrs. Higgler picked up the shovel and handed it to Fat Charlie. "It was a pretty service," she said. "Some of your daddy's old drinking buddies were there, and all the ladies from our street. Even after he moved down the road, we still kept in touch. He would have liked it. Of course, he would have liked it much more you'd been there." She shook her head. "Now, shovel," she said. "And if you've got any goodbyes, you can say them while you're shoveling down the dirt." "I thought it was just meant to do 1 or 2 spadefuls of dirt," he said, "to show willing." "I give the man $30 to go away," said Mrs. Higgler. "I tell him that the departed son is flying all the way from the Hingland, and that he would just want to do right by his father. Do the right thing, not just show willing." "Right," said Fat Charlie. "Absolutely. Got it." He took off his suit jacket and hung it on the fence. He loosened his tie, pulled it over his head, and put it into the jacket pocket. He shoveled the black dirt into the open grave, in thick Florida air, as thick as soup. After a while, it sort of began to rain, which is to say that it was the kind of rain that never comes to a decision about whether it's actually raining or not. Driving in it, you would never have been certain whether or not to turn on your wipers. Standing in it, shoveling in it, you simply got sweatier, damper, and more uncomfortable. Fat Charlie continued to shovel, and Mrs. Higgler stood there with her arms folded across her gargantuan bosom, with the almost rain misting her black dress and her straw hat with 1 black silk rose on it, watching him as he filled in the hole. The earth became mud, and became, if anything, heavier. After what seemed like a lifetime, and a very uncomfortable one at that. Fat Charlie patted down the final shovelful of dirt. Miss Higgler walked over to him. She took his jacket off in the fence and handed it to him. You're soaked from skin. You're soaked to the skin and covered in the dirt and sweat, but you grew up. Welcome home, Fat Charlie, she said, and she smiled, and she held him to her vast breast. I'm not crying, said Fat Charlie. Hush now, said Mrs. Higgler. It's the rain on my face, said Fat Charlie. Mrs. Higgler didn't say anything. She just held him and swayed backward and forward, and after a while Fat Charlie said, It's okay. I'm better now. There's food back in my house, said Mrs. Higgler. Let's get you fed. He wiped the mud from his shoes in the parking lot. Then he got into his gray rental car, and he followed Mrs. Higgler in her maroon station wagon down the streets that had not existed 20 years earlier. Mrs. Higgler drove like a woman who had just discovered an enormous and much-needed mug of coffee, and whose primary mission was to drink as much coffee as she was able to while driving as fast as possible. And Fat Charlie drove behind her, keeping up as best he could, racing from traffic light to traffic light while trying to figure out more or less where they were. And then they turned down a street, and with mounting apprehension, he realized he recognized it. This was the street he had lived on as a boy. Even the houses looked more or less the same, although most of them had now grown impressive wire mesh fences around their front yards. There were several cars already parked in front of Mrs. Higgler's house. He pulled up behind an elderly gray Ford. Mrs. Higgler walked up to the front door, opened it with her key. Fat Charlie looked down at himself, muddy and sweat-stoked. I can't go in looking like this, he said. I seen worse, said Mrs. Higgler. Then she sniffed. I tell you what, you go in there, go straight to the bathroom, and you can wash off your hands and face, clean yourself up, and when you're ready, we'll all be in the kitchen. He went to the bathroom. Everything smelled like jasmine. He took off his muddy shirt and washed his face and hands with jasmine-scented soap in a tiny wash basin. He took a washcloth and wiped down his chest, and scrubbed at the muddiest lumps on his suit trousers. He looked at the shirt, which had been white when he had put it on this morning, and was now a particularly grubby brown, and decided not to put it back on. He had more shirts in his bag, in the back seat of the rental car. He would slip back out of the house, put on a clean shirt, then face the people in the house. He unlocked the bathroom door and opened it. 4 elderly ladies were standing in the corridor staring at him. He knew them. He knew all of them. What are you doing now? Asked Miss Higgler. Changing shirt, said Fat Charlie. Shirt in car, yes, back soon. He raised his chin high and strode down the corridor and out the front door. Now, what kind of language was that he was talking? Asked little Miss Dunwoody behind his back loudly. That's not something you see every day, said Mrs. Bustamante, although, this being Florida's Treasure Coast, if there was something you did see every day, it was topless men, although not usually with muddy suit trousers on. Fat Charlie changed his shirt by the car and went back into the house. The 4 ladies were in the kitchen, industrially packing away into Tupperware containers what looked like it had been recently a large spread of food. Mrs. Higgler was older than Mrs. Bustamante, and both of them were older than Miss Knowles, and none of them were older than Mrs. Dunwoody. Mrs. Dunwoody was old, and she looked it. There were geological ages that were probably younger than Mrs. Dunwoody. As a boy, Fat Charlie had imagined Miss Dunwoody in equatorial Africa, peering disapprovingly through her thick spectacles at the newly erect hominids. Keep out of my front yard, she would tell a recently evolved and rather nervous specimen of Homo habilis, or I gonna belt you around your ear hole. I can tell you. Mrs. Dunwoody smelled of violet water, and beneath the violet she smelled a very old woman indeed. She was a tiny old lady who could outglare a thunderstorm. And Fat Charlie, who had, over 2 decades ago, followed a lost tennis ball into her yard and then broken one of her lawn ornaments, was still quite terrified of her. Right now, Mrs. Dunwoody was eating lumps of curry goat in her fingers from a small Tupperware bowl. Pity to waste it, she said, and dropped the bits of goat bone into a china saucer. Time for you to eat, Fat Charlie? Asked Miss Knowles. I'm fine, said Fat Charlie. Honest. 4 pairs of eyes stared at him reproachfully through 4 pairs of spectacles. No good starving yourself in your grief, said Mrs. Dunwoody, licking her fingertips and picking out another brown, fatty lump of goat. I'm not. I'm just not hungry, that's all. Misery's gonna shrivel you up, away to pure skin and bones, said Mrs. Knowles with gloomy relish. I don't think it will. I'm putting a plate for you at the table over there, said Mrs. Higgler. You go and sit down now. I don't want to hear any other word out of you. There's more of everything, so don't you worry about that. Fat Charlie sat down where she pointed, and within seconds there was placed in front of him a plate piled high with stew peas and rice, and sweet potato pudding, jerk pork, curry goat, curry chicken, fried plantains, and a pickled cow foot. Fat Charlie could feel the heartburn beginning, and he had not even put anything in his mouth yet. Where's everyone else? He said. Your daddy's drinking buddies? They gone off drinking. They gonna have a memorial fishing trip off a bridge in his memory. Mrs. Higgler poured the remaining coffee out of her bucket-sized traveling mug in the sink, and replaced it with the steaming contents of a freshly brewed jug of coffee. Mrs. Dunwoody licked her fingers clean with a small purple tongue, and she shuffled over to where Fat Charlie was sitting, his food yet untouched. When he was a little boy, he had truly believed that Mrs. Dunwoody was a witch. Not a nice witch, more the kind kids had to push into ovens to escape from. This was the first time he'd seen her in more than 20 years, and he was still having to quell an inner urge to yelp and hide under the table. I seen plenty people die, said Mrs. Dunwoody. In my time, get old enough, you'll see it in your own self, too. Everybody gonna be dead one day. Just give it time. She paused. Still, I ain't never thought it would happen to your daddy. And she shook her head. What was he like? Asked Fat Charlie. When he was young. Mrs. Dunwoody looked at him through her thick spectacles, and her lips pursed, and she shook her head. Before my time, was all she said. Eat your cow foot. Fat Charlie sighed, and he began to eat. It was late afternoon, and they were alone in the house. Where you going to sleep tonight? Asked Miss Higgler. I thought I'd get a motel room, said Fat Charlie. When you got a perfectly good bedroom here, and a perfectly good house down the road? You haven't even looked at it yet. You ask me, your father would have wanted you to stay there. I'd rather be at my own, and I don't think I'd feel right about sleeping at my dad's place. Well, it's not my money I'm throwing away, said Mrs. Higgler. You're going to have to decide what you're going to do with all your father's house anyway, and all its things. I don't care, said Fat Charlie. We could have a garage sale, put them on eBay, haul them to the dump. Now, what kind of an attitude is that? She rummaged in a kitchen drawer and pulled out a front door key with a large paper label attached to it. He give me a spare key when he moved, she said, in case he lose his or lock it inside or something. He used to say he could forget his head if it wasn't attached to his neck. When he sell the house next door, he'd tell me, don't you worry, Kellyanne, I won't go far. He lived in that house as long as I remember, but now he decided it's too big, and he need a move house. And still talking, she walked him down to the curb, and drove them down several streets in her maroon station wagon until they reached a 1-story wooden house. She unlocked the front door, and they went inside. The smell was familiar, faintly sweet, as if chocolate chip cookies had been baked there the last time the kitchen was used, but that had been a long time ago. It was too hot in there. Mrs. Higgler led them into the little sitting room, where she turned on a window-fitted air conditioning unit. It rattled and shook and smelled like a wet sheepdog, and moved the warm air around. There were stacks of books piled around a decrepit sofa Fat Charlie remembered from one of his childhood. And there was photographs in frames, one, in black and white, of Fat Charlie's mother while she was young, with her hair up on top of her head all black and shiny, wearing a sparkly dress, and besides it, a photo of Fat Charlie himself, aged perhaps 5 or 6 years old, standing beside a mirrored door, so that it looked at first glance as if two little Fat Charlies, side by side, were staring seriously out of the photograph at you. Fat Charlie picked the top book in the pile. It was a book on Italian architecture. Was he interested in architecture? Passionate about it? Yes. I didn't know that. Mrs. Higgler shrugged and sipped her coffee. Fat Charlie opened the book and saw his father's name neatly written on the first page. He closed the book. I never really knew him, said Fat Charlie. Not really. He was never an easy man to know, said Mrs. Higgler. I knew him for what, 60 years, and I didn't know him. You must have known him when he was a boy. Mrs. Higgler hesitated. She seemed to be remembering. Then she said, very quietly, I knew him when I was a girl. Fat Charlie felt that he should be changing the subject, so he pointed to a photo of his mother. He's got Mum's picture there, he said. Mrs. Higgler took a slurp of her coffee. Them take it on a boat, she said, back before you was born. One of those boats that you had dinner on, and they would sail out 3 miles out of territorial waters, and then there was gambling, and then they come back. I don't know if they still run those boats. Your mother say it was the first time she ever eat steak. Fat Charlie tried to imagine what his parents had been like before he was born. He was always a good-looking man, mused Mrs. Higgler, as if she was reading his mind. All the way to the end. He had a smile that could make a girl squeeze her toes, and he was always a very fine dresser. All the ladies loved him. Fat Charlie knew the answer before he asked the question. Did you? What kind of a question is that to be asking a respectable widow woman? She sipped her coffee. Fat Charlie waited for the answer. She said, I kissed him. Long, long time ago, before he'd ever met your mother. He was a fine, fine kisser. I hoped that he'd call, take me dancing again. Then he vanished. He was gone for what, a year? 2 years? And by the time he came back, I was married to Mr. Higgler, and he's bringing back your mother. It was out on one of the islands he met her. Were you upset? I was a married woman. Another sip of coffee. And you couldn't hate him. Couldn't even be properly angry with him. And the way he looked at her, damn, if he ever did look at me like that, I could have died happy. You know, at their wedding, me was your mother's matron of honor. I didn't know. The air conditioning unit was starting to bellow out cold air. It still smelled like wet sheepdog. He asked, Do you think they were happy? In the beginning. She hefted her huge thermal mug, seemed about to take a sip of coffee, and then changed her mind. In the beginning. But not even she could keep his attention for very long. He had so much to do. He was very busy, your father. Fat Charlie tried to work out if Mrs. Higgler was joking or not. He couldn't tell. She didn't smile, though. So much to do. Like what? Fish off bridges? Play dominoes on the porch? Await the inevitable invention of karaoke? He wasn't busy. I don't think he ever did a day's work all the time I knew him. You shouldn't say that about your father. Well, it's true. He was crap. A rotten husband and a rotten father. Of course he was, said Mrs. Higgler fiercely. But you can't judge him like you judge a man. You gotta remember, Fat Charlie, that your father was a god. A god among men? No, just a god. She said it without any kind of emphasis, as flatly and normally as she might have said he was diabetic, or simply, he was black. Fat Charlie wanted to make a joke of it, but there was that look in Mrs. Higgler's eyes, and suddenly he couldn't think of anything funny to say. So he said, softly, He wasn't a god. Gods are special, mythical. They do miracles and things. That's right, said Mrs. Higgler. We wouldn't have told you while he was alive, but now that he's gone, there can't be any harm in it. He was not a god. He was my dad. You can be both, she said. It happens. It was like arguing with a crazy person, thought Fat Charlie. He realized he should just shut up, but his mouth kept going. Right now his mouth was saying, Look, if my dad was a god, he would have godlike powers. He did. Never did a lot with them, mind you, but he was old. Anyway, how do you think he got away with not working? Whenever he needed money, he'd play the lottery, or go down to Hellendale and bet on the dogs or the horses. Never win enough to attract attention, just enough to get by. Fat Charlie had never won anything in his whole life, nothing whatsoever. In the various office sweepstakes he had taken part in, he was only able to rely on his horse never making out of the starting gate, or his team being relegated to some hitherto unheard of division somewhere in the elephant's graveyard of organized sports. It rankled. If my dad was a god, something which I do not for one moment concede in any way, I should add, then why aren't I a god too? I mean, you're saying I'm the son of a god, aren't you? Obviously. Well then, why can't I bet on horses, or do magic, or miracles, or things? She sniffed. Your brother got all that god stuff. Fat Charlie found he was smiling. He breathed out. It was a joke after all, then. Ah, you know, Mrs. Higgler, I don't actually have a brother. Of course you do. That's you and him, in the photograph. Although he knew what was in it, Fat Charlie glanced over at the photograph. She was mad, all right, absolutely barking. Mrs. Higgler, he said, gently as possible. That's me. Just me when I was a kid. It's a mirror door. I'm standing next to it. It's me and my reflection. It is you. And it's also your brother. I never had a brother. Sure you did. I don't miss him. You were always the good one, you know. He was a handful when he was here. And before Fat Charlie could say anything else, she added, He went away when you were just a little boy. Fat Charlie leaned over. He put his big hand on Mrs. Higgler's bony hand, the one that wasn't holding the coffee mug. It's not true, he said. Luella Dunwitty made him go, she said. He was scared of her, but he still came back from time to time. He could be charming when he wanted to be. She finished her coffee. I always wanted a brother, said Fat Charlie. Somebody to play with. Mrs. Higgler got up. This place isn't going to clean itself up, she said. I've got garbage bags in the car. I figure we'll need a lot of garbage bags. Yes, said Fat Charlie. He stayed in a motel that night. In the morning, he and Mrs. Higgler met, back at his father's house, and they put garbage into big black garbage bags. They assembled bags of objects to be donated to Goodwill. They also filled a box with things Fat Charlie wanted to hold on to for sentimental reasons, mostly photographs from his childhood and before he was born. There was an old trunk, like a small pirate's treasure chest, filled with documents and old papers. Fat Charlie sat on the floor going through them. Mrs. Higgler came in from the bedroom with another black garbage bag filled with moth-eaten clothes. It's your brother, give him that trunk, said Mrs. Higgler, out of the blue. It was the first time she had mentioned any of her fantasies the previous night. I wish I did have a brother, said Fat Charlie, and he did not realize he said it aloud until Mrs. Higgler said, I already told you, you do have a brother. So, he said, where would I go? Where would I find this mythical brother of mine? Later he would wonder why he had asked her this. Was he humoring her? Teasing her? Was it just that he had to say something to fill the void? Whatever the reason, he said it, and she was chewing her lower lip and nodding. You got to know. It's your heritage. It's your bloodline. She walked over to him and crooked her finger. Fat Charlie bent down. The old woman's lips brushed his ear as she whispered. Need him? Tell, What? I say, she said in her normal voice, if you need him, just tell a spider. He'll come on running. Tell a spider? That's what I said. You must think I just talking for my health, exercising my lungs. You ain't never heard of talking to the bees? When I was a girl in St. Andrews, before my folks came here, you would go tell the bees all your good news. Well, this is just like that. Talk to the spider. It was how I used to send messages to your father when he would vanish off. Right. Don't you say right like that. Like what? Like I'm a crazy old lady who don't know the price of fish. You think I don't know which way is up? I'm quite sure you do. honestly." Mrs. Higgler was not mollified. She was far from gruntled. She picked up her coffee mug from the table and cradled it, disapprovingly. Fat Charlie had done it now, and Mrs. Higgler was determined to make sure that he knew it. "I don't gotta do this, you know," she said. "I don't gotta help you. I'm only doing it because your father, he was special, and because your mother, she was a fine woman. I'm telling you big things. I'm telling you important things. You should listen to me. You should believe me." "I do believe you," said Fat Charlie, as convincingly as he could. "Now you're just humoring an old woman." "No," he lied. "I'm not. Honestly, I'm not." His words rang with honesty, sincerity, and truth. He was thousands of miles from home, in his late father's house, with a crazy old woman on the verge of an apoplectic seizure. He would have told her that the moon was just some kind of unusual tropical fruit if it would have calmed her down, and he meant it, as best he could. She sniffled. "That's the trouble with you young people," she said. "You think because you ain't been here long you know everything. In my life, I already forget more than you ever know. You don't know nothing about your father. You don't know nothing about your family. I tell you your father is a god. You don't even ask me what god I was talking about." Fat Charlie tried to remember the names of some gods. "Zeus?" he suggested. Fat Charlie made a noise like a kettle, suppressing the urge to boil. Fat Charlie was fairly sure that Zeus had been the wrong answer. "Cupid?" She made another noise, which began as a sputter and ended in a giggle. "I can just picture your dad wearing nothing but one of them fluffy diapers with a big bow and arrow." She giggled some more. Then she swallowed some coffee. "Back when he was a god," she told him. "Back then, they called him Anansi." Now, probably you know some Anansi stories. Probably there's no one in the whole wide world who doesn't know some Anansi stories. Anansi was a spider when the world was young, and all the stories were being told for the first time. He used to get himself into trouble, and he used to get himself out of trouble. The story of the tar baby, the one they tell about Brer Rabbit, that was Anansi's story first. Some people think he was a rabbit, but that's their mistake. He wasn't a rabbit. He was a spider. Anansi's stories go back as long as people have been telling each other stories. Back in Africa, where everything began, even before people were painting cave lions and bears on rock walls, even then they were telling stories about monkeys and lions and buffalo. Big dream stories. People always had these proclivities. That was how they made sense of their worlds. Everything that ran or crawled or swung or snaked got to walk through those stories, and different tribes of people would venerate different creatures. Lion was the king of the beasts, and even then, and gazelle was the fleetest of foot, and monkey was the most foolish, and tiger was the most terrible. But it wasn't stories about them people wanted to hear. Anansi gave his name to stories. Every story is Anansi's. Once, before the stories were Anansi's, they all belonged to Tiger, which is the name of the people of the islands call all big cats. And the tales were dark and evil and filled with pain, and none of them ended happily. But that was a long time ago. These days the stories are Anansi's. Seeing we were just at a funeral, let me tell you a story about Anansi, the time his grandmother died. It's okay. She was a very old woman and she went in her sleep. It happens. She died a long way from home, so Anansi, he goes across the island with his handcart, and he gets his grandmother's body and puts it on the handcart, and he wheels it home. He's going to bury her by the banyan tree out by the back of his hut, you see. Now he's passing through the town. After pushing his grandmother's corpse in the cart all morning, he thinks, "I need some whiskey." So he goes into the shop, for there's a shop in that village, a store that sells everything, where the shopkeeper is a very hasty-tempered man. Anansi, he goes in and he drinks some whiskey. He drinks a little more whiskey and he thinks, "I shall play a trick on this fellow," so he says to the shopkeeper, "Go take some whiskey to my grandmother, sleeping in that cart outside. You may have to wake her, for she's a sound sleeper." So, the shopkeeper, he goes out to the cart with a bottle, and he says to the old lady in the cart, "Hey, here's your whiskey." But the old lady, she not say anything. And the shopkeeper, he's just getting angrier and angrier, for he was such a hasty-tempered man, saying, "Get up, old woman, get up and drink your whiskey." But the old woman, she says nothing. Then she does something that the loud sometimes do in the heat of day. She flatulates loudly. Well, the shopkeeper, he's so angry with this old woman for flatulating at him that he hits her, and then he hits her again, and now he hits her one more time, and she tumbles down from the handcart onto the ground. Anansi, he runs out and starts a crying and a wailing and a carrying on, and saying, "My grandmother, she's a dead woman. Look what you did. Murderer, evildoer." Now the shopkeeper, he says to Anansi, "Don't you tell anyone I done this," and he gives Anansi 5 whole bottles of whiskey, and a bag of gold, and a sack of plantains and pineapple and mango, to make him hush his carrying on and go away. He thinks he killed Anansi's grandmother, you see. So, Anansi, he wheels his handcart home, and he buries his grandmother underneath the banyan tree. Now the next day, Tiger, he's passing by Anansi's house, and he smells cooking smells. So he invites himself over, and there's Anansi having a feast. And Anansi, having no other option, asks Tiger to sit and eat with them. Tiger says, "Brother Anansi, where did you get all that fine food from? And don't you lie to me. And where did you get all these bottles of whiskey from, and that big bag filled with gold pieces? If you lie to me, I'll tear out your throat." So, Anansi, he says, "I cannot lie to you, brother Tiger. I got them all, for I take my dead grandmother to the village on a handcart, and the storekeeper give me all these good things for bringing him my dead grandmother." Now, Tiger, he didn't have a living grandmother, but his wife had a mother. So he goes home and he calls his wife's mother out to see him, saying, "Grandmother, you must come out now, for you and I must have a talk." And when she comes out and peers around, he says, "What is it?" Well, Tiger, he kills her, even though his wife loves her, and he places her body on a handcart. Then he wheels his handcart to the village, with his dead mother-in-law on it. "Who want a dead body?" he calls. "Who want a dead grandmother?" But all the people, they just jeered at him, and they laughed at him, and they mocked him. And when they saw that he was serious and he wasn't going anywhere, they pelted him with rotten fruit until he ran away. It wasn't the first time Tiger was made a fool of by Anansi, and it wouldn't be the last time. Tiger's wife never let him forget how he killed her mother. Some days it's better for Tiger if he's never been born. That's an Anansi story. Of course, all stories are Anansi stories. Even this one. Olden days, all the animals wanted to have stories named after them, back in the days when the songs that sung the world were still being sung. Back when they were still singing the sky and the rainbow and the ocean. It was in those days when animals were people as well as animals that Anansi the spider tricked all of them, especially Tiger, because he wanted all the stories named after himself. Stories are like spiders with all their long legs, and stories are like spider webs, which man gets himself all tangled up in, but which look so pretty when you look at them under a leaf in the morning dew, and in the elegant way that they connect to one another, each to each. What's that? You want to know if Anansi looked like a spider? Sure he did, except when he looked like a man. No, he never changed his shape. It's just a matter of how you tell the story, that's all. And that's the end of the chapter.